One,
One,
two,
three.
three. Hi, everyone. This is Luke Johnson. I have the pleasure of having Sophie Corre join me today to discuss Carl Jung's Synchronicity. I'm kind of late to the party when it comes to Carl Jung. I read him a little bit early on in college, but it really didn't sync up that much to what was relevant in my life at the time. And throughout my offerings on the internet, Sophie, my friend from France, has nudged me to always look back at Jung. And I think perhaps something was guiding me there the entire time, which we'll get into later today. Now I find myself deeply immersed as I have a research project, which is also directing me back to Jung, where I look primarily at the films of Stanley Kubrick. And so I'm kind of a newbie. I gave a presentation on this book, Synchronicity, 2 weeks ago. I'm largely flying by memory today, so that's a very difficult thing because I think Sophie will agree that this, well, maybe she won't. Maybe she found it easy, but I found this text to be very difficult when I was trying to put together the presentation. And then I have some discussion questions that we'll address in the second half that came up for me as I contemplated Carl Jung's offering. So it's going to be a very casual, laid-back conversation today. And before we get into it, I'll just let Sophie say what she thought about the book in general. What did you think about this text, Sophie? Did you enjoy it? How do you feel it fits in with the rest of what Jung is doing? You have much more experience. I think you've read more widely on Jung than I have.
Yes, I already heard about his concept of synchronicity before from other people, and I've read of other books by Jung, such as Ion, Answer to Job, Mysterium Conjunctionis.
Oh, you're into the out there stuff. Did you understand Aeon and Mysterium Conjunctionis? Because those still elude me.
They are hugely complex, but I think I understood some parts of them.
Well, yeah, I'm currently working on something. I don't know if and maybe you can explain it to me one day. The diamond conception of the self that occurs in Aeon. I went back and I tried to go over it because I'm trying to see if it connects to the 7 diamonds in the Stargate sequence in 2001. I think it might. I think it does. But I found it completely mystifying. So I'm going to have to go back and check that out. Cover to cover. And so, yeah. What did you think about this text? Did you find it difficult? Did you find it challenging? Or did you grasp it rather intuitively from the other work that you had done on Carl Jung?
I think it's easier than the 3 books I mentioned.
Oh, man.
but it's still complex because Jung was very knowledgeable. He knew ancient Greek. He knew a little bit of physics. He knew philosophers. He was how do you say this in English? Someone he was a polymath, of course, and he had a huge culture.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad you found it to be easier than I did. I even when I was doing the presentation for Realize Radio, I had to stop and be like, does anyone else understand what Jung is doing? I'm finding this so difficult to get through. But I think all the books function in a complementary fashion, right? So like once you do kind of have a handle of what's going on here, the other ones start to open up, I find.
Yes, but this concept of synchronicity, he doesn't talk much about it in his other books. Except in Ion, when there is a chapter about astrology, and in this one maybe you can find some references to the theory of synchronicities.
Right. We could talk a little bit about that. To be honest, I think we may have even discussed this a little bit. The parts about astrology and the I Ching, I felt like we were kind of inconclusive in this text. And so I didn't focus on them as much as maybe others did. I feel like those are meant to kind of develop something later, or maybe he didn't develop them later. I didn't find them to be that rewarding, the musings on astrology and the I Ching.
I think the I Ching is more interesting because it's about what's important is the concept of probability and how do you say this in English? Randomness.
I can only imagine how difficult this is to talk about in your second language. It's a struggle even in your first. Well, we should get into it.
Yes.
I think one of the things that we should probably get out of the way that's very helpful is kind of like an overview of the collective unconscious and the archetypal foundation. I think these terms are still kind of imprecise for me, and I don't know if you can add on to it, but it's, a lot of it's going to function for our understanding of what synchronicity is here. And I guess I understand the collective unconscious as that substrate that is passed down and inherited through all participants in the species. And as we go deeper into this, it seems like the collective unconscious, and this is pretty out there into some of my discussion questions, might be something that all of creation participates in some way to some extent. And it has these primordial images, these latent images that correlate to external reality that allow for recognition. They sound a lot like Platonic forms to me. I think there's a lot of debate about that, and then,
yes,
we'll get into it.
And he's also inspired by Kant. Actually, he admits himself that he was a reader of Kant, and Kant talked about the a priori,
the noumenal, the distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal world, and these categories of the mind. I think, and that's an interesting question. Is Kant a Platonist? These debates are still going on within philosophy.
Yes, but Jung admitted that he was inspired by Kant.
Well, Jung was inspired by all sorts of philosophers. He seems to have a paradoxical relationship with philosophers. He seems, he makes a lot of allusions to Leibniz and Schopenhauer in this text, and it sounds like he read them deeply. But then other places, it seems like from other places that I've encountered Jung, he seems to have had sort of a contempt for philosophers and psychoanalyzes them, such as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche.
Yes,
and talks about how they're imbalanced in a variety of different ways. And he's also, and what we also see in the chapter on the forerunners to the concept of synchronicity is like deeply in tune with world religion figures and mystical alchemists that also try to touch on the concept of synchronicity.
Yes. The concept of synchronicity, as he explained, was already in the culture before. There was like we studied with Baudelaire. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah. No, it was a long time ago. Yeah.
The concept of correspondences.
Ah, yeah.
I think he talks about it. I think. I have to check, but I think he talks about it. Maybe it was in the part synchronicity before what was the name of the chapter?
In English, it's the forerunners to the concept.
Yes, and I think he's talking about correspondences, and I remember when we studied. Oh, sorry, I have an issue. I come back.
Well, while Sophie is addressing that. I mean,
Okay, sorry.
okay, it's fine. It's fine. It happens. It's live. It's live internet.
Yes. So when we studied Baudelaire, the Confiteor of the Artist, we talked about the correspondences. I don't know if you remember.
It was a long time ago, but yeah, refresh my memory.
And it was about what happens in the artist environment, such as nature's the phenomena in nature, happened in the same time in his soul.
Yes, yeah, and we'll get into that concept when we talk about
Yes.
the different types of synchronicity. Jung says something very similar about Swedenborg's vision of the Stockholm fire, where he talks about it's because he was having a vision of it that was occurring concurrently with the fire, but he was nowhere near the fire to have it. And he says, oh, it was like the fire was burning within Swedenborg and Stockholm at the same time, right? So he uses this to illustrate a type of synchronistic category. So perhaps we should give a little bit of the backdrop about why Jung, even one of the reasons. I think we should give talk a little bit about the intellectual backdrop that inspired Jung to talk about synchronicity. He had a relationship, a platonic and professional relationship with the esteemed physicist Wolfgang Pauli, which I'm sure Sophie knows all about.
Yes,
And
he wrote a book about him. His name is not present in the book, but Psychology of Alchemy.
he doesn't.
Yes, he talks about a young scientist, but he doesn't say his name, and apparently it's about Pauli.
Well, it gets. I guess anyone can kind of figure that out because later they would be out and out about their how they shared and developed this concept of synchronicity. And I believe they corresponded with each other for decades, and they developed this concept of synchronicity in joint fashion. I haven't read Pauli's stuff. I believe he wrote a paper or a text on Kepler where he addresses some of this. Have you read that? No. I think a lot of this information can be found in the letters that have been compiled. I have the book somewhere around here. I believe it's called Atoms and Archetypes.
Yes, I've read it as well because you told me we were about to study it and we didn't, but I read a part of the book and I bought it.
Well, maybe we can get to that.
Yes.
Maybe we can get to that eventually. I'm sorry I dropped the ball on that. I can't remember what came up. Anyhow, so a big part of this intellectual backdrop, right, is the kind of total, absolute natural laws that were unquestioned, the Newtonian sort of understanding of the world, the clockwork understanding of the world was being abolished by the advances in relativity theory and quantum mechanics. And Jung took this to heart. He was very much, I don't want to say disturbed, but impacted by it, because this would mean that our attempts to understand reality were going to be largely statistically valid, meaning that outcomes would be probable and that there would be episodes that would violate what we would understand a percentage chance of obtaining, and these would be outliers. And we think, eventually we'd be able to explain these outliers, like why they're happening, et cetera, but we don't really. A lot of them are so unique and rare, they're not really subject to, you can't really replicate them in a lab, so we just kind of put up with them and endure with them. And Jung is saying that this, is not going to do, because in addition to this, he's having a lot of experiences of synchronicity. He relates some examples. We'll get to it later, but I mean, one of the ones that everyone knows about was the most impactful to him was he had a young woman that he was analyzing who had a dream of a scarab beetle, and she was she needed a psychological breakthrough, and he couldn't help her do it. And then she had this dream, and while she's telling him about this dream, this gold beetle comes into the analyzing room, and he produces it for her and allows her to have the breakthrough that she needed to transcend her, I guess, Cartesian rationalism, as he puts it. And then he has these other less likely, he has these others potentially less compelling examples that we'll look at in the duplication of cases. But that was the one, at least for Jung, against the intellectual backdrop at the time, that really rattled him and be like, we got to figure out what's going on here, because it seems like with the new physics and with these things like the gold beetle scenario, it seems like we're having things that are causally unconnected producing producing meaningful things in our reality.
And I'm surprised that Jung is not talking about Hermetism in this book.
Hermeticism?
Hermeticism, yes.
Why do you say that? Because I just don't understand Hermeticism yet, so educate me.
Yes. So Hermeticism is a philosophy, and some people say that alchemists were practicing Hermeticism, and the most important text is by how do we say this in English?
Hermes Trismegistus?
Yes, Hermes Trismegistus.
I'm probably butchering it as well. The thrice great Hermes. How about that?
Yes, and what's important in this text is what is below is as what is above, something like this.
As above, yeah. We say as above, so below.
Yes,
yeah.
And to me, it's also talking about synchronicity, this phrase.
I think that's a big deal when we get to the concept of man as the microcosm.
Yes.
Right?
And it's something which is present in medieval philosophy.
Yeah. When I did the presentation, I drew out a quote from Pico, the alchemist and Renaissance philosopher, Pico de Mirandola. Is that how you say his name? Mirandola? Let me see. I'll make
yes,
sure
I know who you're talking about. In French, it's Pic de la Mirandole.
Pico de la Mirandola. There we go. That was the one that when he was talking about the mysticum, the mystical body of Christ, the mystical body of God.
And it's fascinating because Jung is also talking about this concept in Ion and Mysterium Conjunctionis.
I bet he is. I bet he is. So, he tries to get a handle on these acausal events that are happening, and he first examines. He's trying to figure out how he can scientifically understand what's going on here. He turns his attention to the duplication of cases phenomenon. I think this is something we've all experienced, where we kind of latch onto a number and then we start seeing it everywhere, right? We all have our certain ones, like even today is 11/22, right? And there's a lot of numinous qualities that are associated with this day. In America, today's the 60th anniversary of the JFK assassination, right? And what a lot of people, it's also the 60th anniversary of Aldous Huxley died that day, and C.S. Lewis. All three of those died. So the 11s and 22s, we start seeing them everywhere, and they total to 33, and we start seeing the 33s everywhere. But Jung uses examples of you see a number on a movie ticket, and then you start seeing it on the streetcar and everywhere else. He finds these to be kind of uncanny, but still kind of within the realm of rational and probable. And then he moves on to this string of duplicated cases involving fish. Everywhere he's going, he's encountering fish. People are showing him fish, telling him dreams of fish. It's kind of a string of these where he's like, this can't be This
Yes,
can't be with it.
but I think it's an example in which he says it's probably not synchronicity.
Right. Well, he doesn't say that it's not. He says that he can't prove that it is.
Yes,
Right?
but
It feels. He says it feels kind of like ESP, but he needs more proof. He feels like he is anticipating the future and locked on to something.
yes, but he was studying the symbolism of the fish when that
Yes.
happened, so he was thinking about it deeply.
Well, still, you have to admit, people coming to him with dreams and showing him pictures of fish. I mean, that to me doesn't seem like he was just latching on to something. But it causes him. It causes him to look at the scientific work. I don't know how inclined you are to believe it, of J.B. Rhine, and we'll get to J.B. Rhine in a second.
Yes, but in his book Ion, there is a whole chapter about the fish symbolism. So it seems that he was obsessed with the fish symbolism.
Yes, he was, and I'm sure that connects to astrology interests as well, because it's
And
Piscean, right?
to Christ as well.
Yes, yeah, I can see that. Well, okay. So he's like, and maybe he knew that about himself. He's like, look, I'm reading too much into things because I got this interest in Christ and fish and astrology and mythology, et cetera, et cetera. But then he turns to the work of J.B. Rhine. Do you want to talk about the J.B. Rhine experiments, or I can if you want to. All right. So J.B. Rhine was a very important figure in the intellectual and academic landscape in the early part of the 20th century in America. But very few people know about him because I guess it's very taboo to talk about the things that he did. He started the Department of Parapsychology at Duke University. And Sophie, I don't know if you know what Duke is, but Duke is one of the most prestigious schools in the South in America. It's kind of like the Harvard of the South in America. So, they were doing ESP experiments in the 30s at Duke, and what he found in those experiments, he primarily for the purposes that we're concerned with, Jung latched onto this to test out whether or not something like ESP was happening, which he got an inkling of with the fish scenarios. What he was doing is Ryan was presenting subjects with these things called Zinner cards. They're 5 different symbols on cards. If you've seen the beginning of Ghostbusters, have you seen the beginning of Ghostbusters?
No.
Sophie? Okay. Well, Peter Venkman is like shocking these patients to see whether or not they can guess these cards, and he ends up flirting with this blonde and ruining the experiment. But what Ryan was doing, he found that what should have been expected, he was giving subjects, I think they ran the experience 800 times. He was giving the subjects the card game, and they should have, according to statistics, and statistics is a big part of this, should have been guessing 1 in 5, get a correct hit 1 every 5 times. But they ended up getting 1 out of 6.5 times, so it was deviating from chance, whatever that means. And what he found very interesting things in that process. He found when he increased the distance, he was also conducting the experiments with somebody, I believe, who was in Europe, 4,000 miles away. When he increased the distance, it didn't really affect the outcome. It was practically the same outcome, 1 in 6.5. Similarly, with time on a shorter scale, they would have the individuals guess the cards sometimes 2 weeks in advance of them being drawn, and they would still get correct answers. So that communicated to Jung and I suppose Ryan as well that time and space are kind of psychically relative. And then the further thing is then they did these psychokinetic dice experiments where they had the participant kind of wish and hope for certain outcomes, and they found that was when they formed that intention, it actually was successful at bringing about that outcome to above chance, which to Jung indicated that there was something about our emotions that could affect physical matter. And also what Jung picked up from those experiments is that people tended to perform better with the Zinner cards when their interest was reignited, when they were freshened up. When they got bored of guessing the cards or whatever, their results would tend to regress towards the mean and fall off. But when they got excited about it again, then they started to get more and more correct answers. They even had, I think one guy even guessed on one occasion all 25 cards in a row, you know. These were some interesting findings that he came across. I'll let Sophie to chime in on the Rhine experiments.
There was something I remember I wanted to say something, but I forgot what I wanted to say.
Well, maybe it has something to do. Maybe it has something to do with the, you know, Jung interpreted, in addition to the interest being enlivening and getting better results, Jung, and you know, the broad thing that Jung interpreted from this is that because time and space seem to be relative and like psychic factors were influencing outcomes, that this, you know, this took the principle of causality and the transmission of energy off the table. It doesn't make sense for how these things can interact, especially when something from the future, you know, that hasn't even occurred yet, such as a drawing of a card, is somehow affecting the present moment, our understanding of what's going on here. So we're going to need some sort of acausal principle that can explain these results that lie outside of chance.
It makes me think about quantum physics, the phenomena of entanglement, which is not, which seems to be independent of time and space.
Right. I'm sure that's what Jung had in mind and develops it much more in the book that we talked about earlier with Wolfgang Pauli, The Correspondences. But yes, I think that's what he has in mind.
And it seems to me that this phenomena, what happens in the psyche is outside of time and space.
Yeah, and that gets. I saw your responses to some of my questions earlier. You're like, oh, Jung's not a theologian. He's not talking about these claims, these metaphysical claims. I'm like, yes, he is. Yeah, I know what you're saying.
No, that's not what I said. I said Jung says he's not a theologian. He's not talking about the metaphysical God because he repeats this all the time, so people will he hopes people will believe him.
I guess I didn't pick up on the sarcasm in the or the humor in the.
Maybe he's being honest because he wants to study this from the perspective of a scientist, and that's what he's trying to do.
Well, he's kind of trying to have his cake and eat it too. I think that accounts for the kind of impenetrable nature of his language. You know, over and over, he's really self-conscious about talking about these subjects, and he kind of dresses it up in, I think, unnecessarily complex scientific language to add credibility to it.
Yes, I want to explain it more. I think it's important what he says when he says there is a difference between the God image in the psyche and the metaphysical God. It's not the same thing.
Yeah, I kind of put that together as I was doing background on discussion questions. But let's hold that discussion until the end because we still have a little bit more to cover in regards to the text. So he says, and this harkens back to the scarab, the golden scarab incident that we talked about. He says that the subject is not unlike the woman who came to him to be analyzed with the prophetic dream about the gold beetle. That there is something about her, so there's something archetypal in her collective unconscious that is penetrating up into consciousness and is somehow, I don't want to say orchestrating or anticipating that the beetle is going to show up there. And he thinks similarly, the people that are in these Rhine experiments are put into an impossible situation where they cannot know the future, and they're hamstrung, and it brings the archetypal foundation of the collective unconscious higher and higher, so they have greater access to it through consciousness to anticipate what's going to happen. And okay, you're like, okay, great, but this gets into kind of a metaphysical understanding of reality, which we're going to get into in a second. So I had this presentation that I did. I had notes to look at slides 16 and 17. Okay, yes. To help us understand what is going on here with synchronicity. And by the way, maybe we need just briefly, I've got a little definition here. If it isn't already apparent what synchronicity is, on page 25, it says, I choose this term because the simultaneous occurrences of two meaningfully but not causally connected events seem to me an essential criterion. Synchronicity therefore means the simultaneous occurrence of a certain psychic state with one or more external events which appear as meaningful parallels to the momentary subjective state, and in certain cases, vice versa. And he gives us these three synchronistic categories. So we've talked, the beetle would be an example of this one. I'm just going to quote him. The coincidence of a psychic state in the observer with a simultaneous objective external event that corresponds to the psychic state or content, where there is no evidence of a causal connection between the psychic state and the external event, and where considering the psychic relativity of space and time, such a connection is not even conceivable. So you have this dream of the scarab, and then it's almost immediately confirmed as, I guess, ESP later on. And then we have this example we talked about with Swedenborg and the Stockholm Fire, where an event is happening concurrently with a vision. And he says the coincidence of a psychic state with a corresponding, more or less simultaneous external event taking place outside the observer's field of perception, i.e. at a distance and only verifiable afterwards. And then the third, he talks about how he had a patient who was seeing him for psychological reasons, and during the course of that, he had related stories about flocks of birds like descending upon funerary homes and altars and things like that of deceased relatives. And during the course of analysis, Jung noted that the man was showing some signs of heart disease, very, very subtle signs, and recommended that he get checked out. I don't think he made a big deal. Jung didn't really scare him or anything like that. He just said, hey, you need to go get this checked out. And the day that he went to go to the doctor, a flock of birds landed on his home. And I don't think it had registered with him, but the wife was very unsettled by this. And Jung says that it was triggering something in her collective unconscious. And he goes to the doctor checks him out, he gets a clean bill of health, but on the walk home, he collapses and dies of a heart attack, kind of confirming the wife's suspicion that something terrible was wrong. And he says, the coincidence of a psychic state with a corresponding not yet existent future event that is distant in time and can likewise only be verified afterwards. So that would be the example of the third category.
Yes, I think it's dangerous, this concept of synchronicity, if you have a tendency to have OCD. Because
what, me? What,
no, me.
Are you talking about me?
No, I'm not talking about you, but me. I have some OCD, and sometimes when we have OCD, we have some magical thinking, and
is magical thinking bad?
Well, when we imagine catastrophes all day long, it can
I guess yeah, that's not good. That's not good. But when we're right, when we get it right every 1,000th time, aren't we justified?
I don't know. Well, I think we have to be careful about interpreting signs when we are anxious people.
I don't know. You don't think it's a gift from God or something?
Well, if we think something bad is going to happen 100 times and we are right only one on on 100 times, I don't think it's a reliable tool.
Well, yeah, no, this raises a very interesting question about what synchronicity is trying to do, right? And
Yes.
what is we say it's meaningful. Well, how is it meaningful? Like meaningful to who? And that we'll take that
Yes,
up in the
I make a difference between synchronicity and magical thinking in my own experience. I think it's not at all the same, and synchronicity. I don't have synchronicity related to bad events, but more about if there is a subject I'm fascinated by. It's like events are going to help me understand this subject more. And it's as if I was being taught a lesson. And I think for me, it's how I experience synchronicity.
Yeah, we hadn't really talked about our own experiences with synchronicity. I think we should here when we get to the discussion. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I assumed, though you and I have not talked about it directly, that synchronicity is a part of your life. Hence why you were interested in talking about this with me. For me, I experience them all day long, every day.
I have very impressive synchronicities. I can tell you with my mother and related to church burning.
To Notre Dame?
Yes, Notre Dame.
Oh, well, why don't you do you want to tell us about it?
Yes. So the day before Notre Dame was burning, we were visiting an old lady, and we were watching the mass from the cathedral the day it happened. The day it happened, I think. We were watching a video of a mass on TV of a mass which were occurring in Notre Dame, and my mother told me you should go to Notre Dame because maybe it won't. Maybe you won't be able to go in the future, something like this. And I don't know why she said this. And then I don't know if it was the same day or the day after. It burned. and we had another one with another church in Paris, an Orthodox church named after what's his name? He's a very famous Orthodox saint of the what's his name?
I am not up on my Orthodox saints.
And it's scary because the yes and
Saint Seraphim?
Yes.
Saint Seraphim of Sarav?
Yes, and I think his name is related to fire.
Oh, whoa.
And we were talking...
Oh, yeah, I love how you say fire. That's right.
Yes. And
that might be a synchronicity.
Yes. I almost never talk about him, and especially to my mother. And one day I talk about him, and I don't know if it was this day or the day after, we learned that a church named of Seraphim was burning.
It's sort of, it gets in the same ballpark as the Swedenborg Stockholm fire.
Yes. Yes.
I have them so frequently. I decided in the course of preparing for this and presenting on this, I've started to keep a synchronicity journal.
Yes.
Just to see if I can get anything, because I haven't. When they've happened to me, like I take screenshots and pictures and record memos, but it was all disorganized. And now I've just started making a habit to write them down each day. I was like, well, if people do dream journals, I guess I can do a synchronicity journal.
Yes, I wrote one of them, which is recent. I don't know if I can see it. Oh, yes, I have it. Related to light. I was doing some research about light, the different wavelengths, and I was not even thinking about it, and I watched the movie all the lights we cannot see. And it's about, well, it's a metaphor, but it's talking about the different wavelengths of light.
Cool. Well, we've sort of talked about this earlier when we talked about the intellectual tradition that Jung is operating out of. He tries to find these forerunners to synchronicity. People talking about, you're in contact with this absolute knowledge of the unconscious, although they probably wouldn't have used that terminology. I latched onto the Pico de Mirandola understanding of the mystical body of Christ, of God, where everything is sort of arranged in advance. And I think Jung ends up talking about the parallelism between psychic and physical events and comes up with this concept of continuous creation that essentially, as I understand it, and you can correct, it's a very difficult thing to express, and perhaps you can help me refine it. I think some of the discussion questions will help too. This involves man being a microcosm of, I guess, the unus mundus, the world soul, that from eternity there is sort of a pattern that is already present outside of space and time, that as we enter into creation, this ordering between causal and acausal events is lined up in such a way from that eternal perspective that it creates these synchronous events. And it leads him to postulate these, he has this quaternio, right, where there are different factors that force our judgment of natural processes. He refined it with Wolfgang Pauli, where he had on the north axis indestructible energy, the south axis space-time continuum. To the right, he had inconstant connection through contingence or meaning. That's the synchronicity principle. And to the left, he had constant connection through effect and causality. And all these things work together, can sort of conspire in a way together in order to produce the synchronous events like the gold bug appearing to the woman who's being analyzed by Jung. And I think he's saying that this unconscious archetypal foundation that is coming from eternity, my understanding of it, I'm very new to a lot of this stuff with Jung, is that this interpenetrates at least all living matters. I mean, it's there within us as human beings, but it's also within lower organisms who don't have higher brain structures. They seem to be tapped into it as well. It seems like even plants and I guess matter itself might have some psychic dimension to it. So I thought this was profoundly fascinating. I'm not doing it justice, but what do you think, Sophie?
About what in particular?
Any of it? Did anything I just say resonate with you? Do you disagree with anything that I just said, or do you want to add anything?
About the unus mundus,
Or just kind of the conception of what allows for us to anticipate things that we shouldn't know is having everything kind of being in touch with this substrate of the collective unconscious that is the psychoid factor that's from outside time, that seems to have knowledge that it shouldn't have, given that these things have already, the pattern, whatever that means, is already existing in eternity, and in some ways is conspiring to set up synchronous events in time as it is unfolding. And it can operate through dreams. It can operate even through the lower minds and nervous systems of something like a bug.
Yes. I don't know if you're familiar with a friend of Jung, who was a French philosopher, Henri Corbin.
No, I'm not familiar. Can you say his name again and tell us a little bit about him?
Henri Corbin. So he was a French philosopher who studied Muslim mystics, and he invented the concept of the imaginal world, and in his definition, it's an intermediary world between the material world and the spirit world, and in this intermediary world, that's when the dreams occur, and when mystics have visions, and it's different from imagination. It's that it how to describe it, and
did you ever watch Twin Peaks?
No.
Between Two Worlds, Fire, Walk With Me, this like cryptic poem that some of the individuals say.
Oh, okay. And there is another concept that some Russian Christians, Orthodox Christians, invented, and especially some of them, there was Soloviev at first, the Sophiology, and some of them, they emigrated to France during the 20th century. One of them was Bulgakov, and I don't know, he wrote about Sophiology, which is it's quite complicated, but it's in my opinion, it's about this world soul, this intermediary world within Christianity.
Yeah, the deeper I go into this, the more, I mean, it's really resonating with me. I have to say this book, going deep into this book, kind of is reshaping how I look at things. I don't know if it had an impact on you. Obviously, it had an impact on you. You've been into Jung longer than I have, but this is kind of changing.
Yes, and I'm frustrated because I would like to express things in a more precise way, but I'm not sure I can find the right words, and I hope people are understanding what I'm trying to say.
I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
Trust me. You're good. You're good. Well, I kind of wanted to move on to some of these discussion questions. I've got about, to be honest, I have probably 20 minutes, and maybe so we can go through these somewhat quickly. And, you know, I mentioned the unus mundus, this concept of the world soul for Jung, and I'm learning as I go here. I'm not any authority on Jung, as you guys already can tell, but the first thing that came to my mind is trying to understand this relationship with God and man, given this world soul idea and this collective unconscious that I guess is deeply woven into reality. Like, how do we understand the relationship that God and man have. And this goes back to the microcosm, macrocosm. And it seems like, like you were saying earlier, Jung is not really a metaphysician or a theologian. He's primarily concerned with what's going on in man. And what we think about God from a transcendent perspective is different from whatever this God concept is. And that the God archetype that is within the collective unconscious, which I've done a little bit of research on. And like you were saying, they're not exactly the same thing. Maybe this quote will help us. I found this from this blog. Speaking of Jung, this is from a book, an excerpt from a book called "The Illness That We Are: A Jungian Critique of Christianity" by John P. Dorley, PhD. He says, the mode of thinking which arises from this experience he related to the Western idea of the interpretation of microcosm and macrocosm. With his concept of synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle, Jung takes the position that each time and space-bound ego has access to the macrocosmic totality through the microcosm in the individual unconscious. This theory, both in alchemy and as formulated by Jung in his writings on synchronicity, which in turn he related to modern physics, presupposes a common ground or collective unconscious from which individual centers of consciousness emerge. This common ground thus make it possible for individual centers ultimately to be united one with another in patterns of empathic intensity. I guess the question for me, Sophie, is, I have all sorts of things, is like, I suppose the teleology of Jungian thought is to make each psyche whole in some way as individuals. And I guess man as the microcosm has this imago Dei or whatever within him. And it seems like Jung wants to say that the divine is participating in us. Do you understand what's going here? Is that God is trying to accomplish something through man?
Yes, I think you should read Answer to Job.
Yeah, I read it when I was 19, but I need to do it again because I think his idea in Answer to Job is that God is evolving.
Actually, the God image we don't know about the metaphysical.
Oh, yeah. Well, you go. Yeah, let loose. I want to hear what you have to say.
But yeah, it's not clear the distinction between the two in this book, and it seems to me that in Answer to Job, what he's saying that in the Job story, actually God is being less morally developed than Job. And when God realizes this, he decides to incarnate in a man, which is Christ. But
well, this is highly controversial because this is placing man above God.
Yes, and there is something strange in this Job story. Is that Yahweh and the devil are conspiring together against Job. Yes, we read it together, I think. Yes, especially the end when he shows him how he created the earth and all the monsters.
I feel like this would be like the best movie ever made if someone could do that. So, yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but keep going.
Yes, and so in Jung's mind, he incarnated in order to understand what it was to be a man. And it was his answer to Job that was the incarnation. And then what Jung said, that he said that the incarnation was incomplete because Jesus Christ was perfect. He was only good. And so he didn't incarnate in an ordinary human being who is both good and evil. And if I understand well, Jung thinks that in the end, maybe now or I don't know when exactly, but God is going to incarnate in ordinary human beings. and this how to talk about this.
I think you're doing just fine. It probably needs to be plainly said, like you're saying it, because I think that I can't. It's been a while since I've encountered Answer to Joe, but I think that's the idea, and I see how this would line up with what Kubrick is doing.
Kubrick.
Stanley Kubrick.
Yes. Which movie are you talking about?
Well, all of them.
All of them.
But I recently watched 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I'm thinking, oh, this whole movie is Jungian. This whole thing.
Okay. And maybe this, in my opinion, maybe this is related to what we are experiencing now, because we are more and more connected because of globalization and the internet, and it seems to me that it's related to the archetype of the self. And there is a book by Edinger, who is a Jungian yes, yes, I don't think they met very often, but I admired Jung very much, and he wrote several books about Jung's books, and he wrote a book about the archetype of the apocalypse, and in his opinion, well, the apocalypse it's describing perhaps an historical event, but it's also describing something which is happening in everyone's life. And so the apocalypse would mean that the self will reveal himself to human beings. And I wonder if it's related to our era, where we are so interconnected with each other all over the world. Like now, we are in 2 different countries and we are talking about Jung.
Exactly. I see this. I think it pairs well. I just finished Jung's book on UFOs, like the modern myth of UFOs, and it seems that's kind of his take too, is that these are psychic visions that happen when you enter an apocalyptic age, which he thought we were entering into as a result of the atom bomb and the space race, and in the wake of World War.
Have you heard about Jung's last vision before he died?
I think I might have, but refresh my memory.
Actually, it's in a short movie about his assistant, Marie-Louise von Franz. And she said that Jung had a vision before he died, which he called the 50 last years before the end of humanity, something like this. And he wrote a diagram, and he gave his notes to Marie-Louise von Franz, but she kept these notes to herself, and she never published them. And a lot of people would like to know about it, and she didn't want to to give us many details. I think she was afraid.
So do we know now? Are they out now?
No, we don't know. And there is someone who wrote it on Reddit, the website. Someone contacted maybe the edition which publishes Marie-Louise von France books, and they didn't want to answer.
Oh boy. Well, but there's been disclosure. Some, the red books and the black books. There's been a lot of stuff that
Yes.
perhaps we'll see some of this.
I hope so. We will see them.
Yeah.
Because Jung also had a vision about World War One.
That's right. That's right. I remember listening to interviews, and he said he was not caught off guard by World War One because so many of his patients were having prophetic dreams about it.
And him too. He had a very powerful vision, and it was after his breakup with Freud.
I had a little something like that. I now that you think, these events are sort of forcing me into it, but I remember right after 9/11, and this isn't like some great predictive event, but I remember, America was trying to figure out how to respond. And I remember having a dream that ended up looking very much like the shock and awe campaigns that were put on the television screen with both the Afghanistan and the Iraq War. These images of bombs and things like that falling from the sky, missiles and things like that. And at the time, and even until you brought this up, I thought, oh yeah, like maybe I just kind of picked that up from the news and was sort of anticipating that, because it was so obvious. I didn't really think about it too much at the time, but maybe I was experiencing something from the collective unconscious.
That's possible.
Yeah, maybe. So my next question, and we've got about 4 minutes left here, so we're not going to be able to get through everything. I'm sorry we're on a little bit of a time crunch today, but I had questions with this concept of the psyche and the unus mundus and what this meant for free will. And it seems, I looked into it a little bit. Jung talks about free will in Aeon a little bit. And here's just one quote. The ego is by definition subordinate to the self and is related to it like a part of the whole. Inside the field of consciousness, it has, as we say, free will. But just as our free will clashes with necessity in the outside world, so also it finds its limits outside the field of consciousness in the subjective inner world, where it comes into conflict with the facts of the self. So I guess the answer to the question is there is a slight window for free will to happen with the individual for Jung, but it is heavily subjected to both inner and outer forces, and it's really difficult to tell when you are making a decision how much agency you even have in that decision, because your hand might be forced by something that's going on the unconscious level. That's what I took from that.
I don't know if it's Jung who said something about God being like fate, or or the self being what disturbs your life. There is a quote like this, I think it's by Jung. I need to find it. I think it's in Edinger, a book about Job. This book, I think it's Encounter with the Self, and it's about the illustration of the book of Job by William Blake. I wonder if this quote is in this book. I'm not sure.
Well, I think we've got about 2 minutes left here. I think this is a great episode. I think we covered a lot of really interesting things, and putting it together, especially the discussion questions, really helped me get a better handle on this. So I don't know. Sophie, this is such I'm not going to be done with Jung. Like, I'm going to keep going down this route. And so maybe we can continue some of these themes in the future with something else. If you're up for it, I'd love to keep going at some point. But I think we've given everyone and ourselves a lot to chew on for today. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
Yes, so to sum up the concept of synchronicity, I think Jung insisted that there was the first relation between events was causality, which is from present to future, and so which is related to time and space. And the second type of relationship between events, so it's synchronicity, and it is about events which are rare, whereas causality is a everyday relationship between events. And the scientific methods can only analyze causality because the scientific method is about great numbers and statistics, whereas synchronicity is about exceptions and rare events, like you said, and non-reproducible.
That's right. That's right. Well, I've wondered, he says that, the synchronistic events are rare, but if there is there are these parallel processes of physical and psychical events that are happening, and we notice the synchronistic events when they start to defy our understandings of causality, and it makes me wonder if that psychic physical thing wasn't aligned all the time. Like, why posit that it's inconstant? It just may be in those episodes when something is violating chance that it comes to our attention. But I could see a psychic dimension, and this gets deeper into the metaphysics of it. For Jung, it seems like all of reality is interpenetrated with some form of psychological activity. So this gets in. I don't know if this gets into a question if he thought like matter and everything like that had consciousness to some degree.
Yes,
whatever that means.
I think he thinks that it's what's happening in alchemy. I think he thinks in alchemy what happens in matter is also happening at the same time in the mind of the alchemist.
Yeah. All right, we're going to have to pick this up another time. I'm up against a hard break, but I want to thank Sophie so much for joining me today. We had a few technical difficulties. We'll try to get that all ironed out, but I think this is going to be a really great episode. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, and goodbye, everyone.